which is a very, as they say according to fuqaha, ma'rikatul ara, from the opinions which has been highlighted by the fuqaha regarding the differences that are found in the opinions of reciting behind the imam. So the first thing we need to understand is qira'ah is a mandatory command, a mandatory act in salah. Without it, salah is not valid. Now, if you're praying individually and you don't do qira'ah, and qira'ah means lips movement. لا يكون بالقراءة حتى تحركت شفتاه. Ibn Abidin mentions in Fatawa that until your lips are not moving, it's not considered as qira'ah. So when we say that qira'ah is a mandatory act of salah, at the time of your recitation, during your prayer, your lips needs to move. A lot of people like to pray silent salah. Like lips are not moving and it says I'm praying, I'm reading in my mind. So that reading of mind is not going to validate your prayer. If you have done that, then from now on, stop doing that. Your lips needs to move because there has to be sir, and sir, as the definition mentions, that enough, you have to be enough loud to hear yourself. So that's where the definition of sir is, that you're able to listen to your own self when you're reading. So now when you come behind the imam, what's the ruling? Do you still have to pray? You still have to recite or no? So there are two differences of opinion regarding the qira'ah behind the imam. And both of them have been widely accepted, proven through many narrations of hadith, and we're not going to go into that debate of which opinion is greater than the other, but to know that the fact that both opinion exists, and if you are following one of the two, you're completely fine and your salah is intact. There is no problem with your prayer. So the first opinion is that there is no qira'ah behind the imam, period. Right? The Prophet ﷺ said, "Man kana lahu imamun fa qira'atul imami lahu qira'atun, wa idha qara'a fansitu." That whoever has an imam, the imam's qira'ah becomes his qira'ah. So whenever the imam is reciting, you should be quiet and listen. The other set of scholars, they say that you can skip the surah recitation, but you still have to recite Fatiha for your salah to be valid. So now, as soon as the imam finishes his Fatiha, you can just read your own Fatiha by yourself and finish it off for that salah to be valid. If you are praying behind an imam who follows the opinion that there is no qira'ah for the muqtadi, if they're praying behind the imam, then that rule does not apply to you anymore, because al-imamu dhaminun, which imam has been taking care of your prayer. So whichever salah that the imam is praying, your salah is still valid. So now, if you are doing recitation of al-Fatiha behind the imam, your salah is valid. If you're not doing recitation of al-Fatiha behind the imam, your salah is still valid. There is no saying that this salah is not valid. Yes, both opinions have there are hadith from the four imams. Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayhi, along with his two students, Imam Abu Yusuf and Muhammad ibn al-Ais Hassan al-Shaybani, has taken the opinion, la qira'ata khalf al-imam. There is no qira'at behind the imam at all, no Fatiha, nothing else. Even in the sirri salawat, you just be quiet behind the imam. You don't read anything. Even in jahri, of course, you hear the imam, so you don't read. But even in sirri salah, like the dhuhr and asr, you don't recite anything behind the imam, and your salah will be valid. The other three imams, Imam Ahmed ibn Hanbal, Imam Malik, and Shafi'i, has mandated al-Fatiha that needs to be happening before for your salah to be valid. So if you're praying the sirri salah, which the imam doesn't recite, you just recite your own Fatiha, loud enough that you can hear, and not loud as the person next to you can hear. So if you're loud, that the person next to you is hearing you, you need to quiet down. Because it's sir, right? That's been agreed upon. So you cannot do jahr in where there is sir required, meaning praying in quiet salah versus loud salah. Now, if you are following the other opinion, your salah is still valid. Both opinions have been established through the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If anyone has a follow-up question, then you can submit that question and we'll address it next. Dir'i Rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. This chapter is regarding the armor of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. There are two things that the the muhaddithun has mentioned regarding the armor. Number one is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam wore an armor during all his battles, and that proves the fact that a person should not leave out means, no matter how much tawakkul he has developed in his life, because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had the greatest amount of tawakkul to Allah, and despite of that, he adopted means in all areas of his life. Number two, Babu ma ja'a fi lubsi dir'i Rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. This ahadith are going to be mentioned, proving the fact that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam wore an armor and not actually describing the armor, right? So these narrations are not going to describe how the armor of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam was, but rather that he wore an armor. Now, there are based on different narrations, the Prophet ﷺ had total of 7 armors. And each of those armor had their own names, right? So the most famous from the 7 were the 3 armors. The first one is Sughdiya. Sughdiya was an armor which was the most, strong armor of the Prophet ﷺ, and which was made by a very strong metal. And this armor, it was actually given to the Prophet ﷺ by Ubadah bin Samit radiallahu anhu, and this was the same armor which was put in rahan in the hand of a Jew at the time of the demise of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. The next 2 famous armor were Fudul and Fidda. Fudul because it was long, and Fidda which was made out of silver. Now, these armors, they were given to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and most of the time the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam wore them together, because one was the inner and the other one was the outer. So the Fudul was the outer one and Fidda was the inner one, and that's what the Prophet ﷺ usually wore in most of his battles. Now, regarding the first armor, Sughdiya, it is also mentioned in narrations that this was the type of material that Dawood alayhi salam used to make his armor, right? Because the Prophet Allah Azza wa Jal mentions in the Quran that وَأَلَنَّا لَهُ الْحَدِيدَ نِعْمَ السَّابِغَاتِ وَقَدِّرْ فِي السَّرْدِ وَأَعْمَلُوا صَالِحًا, that showing Dawood alayhi salam, we made the iron very soft for you, and he used to make armors with the iron with his own hand, and he used to sell them, and that's how you used to make money, and never used to take anything from the treasury, as is mentioned about Dawood alayhi salatu wassalam. So now going on to the hadith, there are 2 ahadith in this chapter, and both of them are mentioning pretty much the same matter regarding the armor of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. وبه قال حدثنا أبو سعيد بن عبد الله بن سعيد الأشج قال حدثنا يونس بن بكير عن محمد بن إسحاق عن يحيى بن عباد بن عبد الله الزبير عن أبيه عن جده عبد الله بن الزبير عن زبير بن عوام رضي الله عنه قال كان على النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يوم أحد درعان فنهض إلى الصخرة فلم يستطع فأقعد طلحة تحته وصعد النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم حتى استوى على الصخرة قال سمعت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول أوجب طلحة. وبه قال حدثنا محمد بن أبي عمر قال حدثنا سفيان بن عيينة عن يزيد بن خسيفة عن السائب بن يزيد أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كان عليه يوم أحد درعان قد ظهر بينهما. The first hadith is narrated by Zubayr ibn Awam radiyallahu anhu. So there are 2 Sahaba narrating the hadith. The first is Abdullah ibn Zubayr, and then Zubayr ibn Awam. Abdullah ibn Zubayr is the son of Zubayr ibn Awam radiyallahu anhu. And Abdullah ibn Zubayr, he was at that time, and the Battle of Uhud, he was 3 years old, right? So he narrates from his own father, Zubayr ibn Awam, radiyallahu anhu, that on the day of Uhud, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was wearing 2 pieces of armor, dir'an, the inner and the outer. And he attempted to climb upon a rock, but was unable. So he had Talha radiyallahu anhu sit by the rock as he climbed upon him, and then he climbed upon until he reached the top of the rock. And I heard the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying, Talha has made it paradise incumbent. The next hadith is mentioned by Sa'ib ibn Yazid rahimahullah, Yazid radiyallahu anhu. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam during the Battle of Uhud wore 2 pieces of armor overlapping to others, so one over the other. Now, in the Battle of Uhud, if you know, we know about a little history that the Battle of Uhud was a battle which kind of switched sides in the middle of the battle. And after looking at the victory, the Muslims had to see a lot of difficulties, and the Prophet ﷺ was badly wounded in the Battle of Uhud. So when the Prophet ﷺ was wounded, he moved back away from the Battle of Uhud into an area underneath a big rock. And then the news started to spread that Na'udhu Billah, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has departed from this world. So now the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had to be at a very higher place where everybody could see him. And he can announce that, Ibadallah, O people of Allah, come this way, and so that people can know that he is still alive, and whoever or the news that they have been hearing is a rumor. So the Prophet ﷺ was very bad, he was badly wounded, and there was blood that was coming out from his Mubarak body. And at that time, even though, Muhaddithun has mentioned 2 different things here. Number one is the strength of the Prophet ﷺ, despite the fact of being in that stage, had much greater than a normal human being. But this was an opportunity that the Prophet ﷺ granted Talha radiyallahu anhu, who took the arrows of the enemies on his body to protect the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Talha radiyallahu anhu was standing, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was about to or trying to climb. And at that time, Talha radiyallahu anhu kneeled down, and he put the Mubarak feet of the Prophet alayhi salam upon his shoulders, and then he lifted himself up to lift the Prophet alayhi salam higher so he can climb up to this big rock where everybody can see him. Now at that time, the third opinion that the Muhaddithun has mentioned, the weight of the 2 armors, because they were not just piece of cloth, they were made out of chains and metal and other types of heavy material, that it was so heavy that the Prophet ﷺ, he needed an assistant to climb up, because having an armor on, it's not an easy thing. So that's why Talha radiyallahu anhu helped the Prophet alayhi salam, despite everything else, but having that honor to lift the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam was something that Talha radiyallahu anhu remembered, and he used to be very, happy about the incident that he was the one that had the opportunity to, to boost the Prophet alayhi salam and to carry him upon his shoulder. And upon this, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said to Talha that, "Awjaba ya Talha," that, "Oh Talha, Allah has made paradise incumbent upon you." And Talha ibn Zubayr radiyallahu anhu is one of the 10 people who have been given glad tidings of being from the people of Jannah in this world by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as we know them as Ashara Mubashara. So Talha radiyallahu anhu is one of the Ashara Mubashara. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the love that the Sahaba had for the Prophet alayhi salam, and to know about the descriptions and the struggles of Nabi alayhi salam. It is part of our deen that we know about these struggles, so we can send as much as salutations and appreciate the fact that Allah Azza wa Jal has given us such a great prophet who had gone through all these difficulty for us, and he continued to make dua for us at every junction so that we can appreciate this fact. We ask Allah to grant us the understanding and the ability to practice. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Subhanallah wa bihamdi. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika wa nashhadu